Oby, it's good to see you again. We were just discussing about 2 years since we were last working together. But I think that we're here today to discuss a very, very important topic about how the violence that began in Nigeria in the 1960s still has an echo today in the Northeast. And in the green room, we were talking about where were we at the moment when violence began back in the late 1960s. And I remember in 1968, it was my very first political action in New Zealand. With a group of 20 students, we walked 26 miles to raise awareness for what was happening in Biafra, because the images of the war and of the humanitarian disaster at that point in time were just beginning to emerge into the international press. And as young people, we were horrified, of course, by the humanitarian disaster, but we didn't understand anything about what had caused this, what had led to the conflict, and we certainly didn't appreciate in faraway New Zealand the kind of aftermath that would come, the efforts at reconciliation, but at the same time, the efforts seem not to have been quite enough to have prevented further difficulties and further instances of violence in Nigeria today.
You know, it's quite interesting that you talked about walking 26 miles. During the Biafran Civil War, I was barely 4 years old. I had been born in Lagos. My dad got transferred from Lagos to Port Harcourt, another city in Nigeria, the south of Nigeria. And we were only just beginning to stabilize into that city when the war broke out. And at the time that the war broke out, my dad had been called back to his office, their office in Lagos. And so here was my mom with this 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old sister, and she was pregnant with my brother. And the war broke, and she just kept hoping that my dad was going to return and decide what next they were going to do. My dad didn't return. City was emptying, and at some point she decided she just had to do something. And so she began the walk, the exodus, alongside many people who were leaving the Port Harcourt city on a journey toward my own village. And she still tells the story. She doesn't laugh at all when she's telling the story of the tragedy of having to carry my 1.5-year-old sister, and I was 2.5, a bit of, I was 4. I was kind of chubby, and I could hold my own ground. And she said I was determined to carry as many of the things that I felt my dad, would regret not having with him. So it was quite something to have experienced that. By some dint of fortune, we were able to get to my village, which is a town, within a town in the Newi local government. And in my own part of the world, the Newi local government, there was some measure of security. So we became the place where refugees ran into. And so my father's compound, my grandfather's compound, having come from a very big family, my great-grandfather had 35 wives, and that was okay. All of you laughing. If I investigated, some of you might come from ancestry that did better than my great grandfather. So and then my grandfather reduced the number, and he had 15 wives. So my dad didn't follow that path, but here was this large compound, and refugees had flown into, just come into it, and it was a huge colony of people. And here I was, not quite having to make a change, having to adapt. And my mom said it was rapid. Because what happened was, over time, food supplies were cut off, and it was hard to survive on much. And my mom said that I became so mature overnight because of the war. And that what happened was I became like a surrogate mom to my sister, because my mom had to deal with so many things because of the number of people. And my sister became, she became so ill and had kwashiorkor. My sister had this protruding belly, and I hated the sight of my sister being in that situation. Then the Catholic relief would bring relief to the Catholic Church up on the hills. And I would say to my mom, I would take the responsibility of making sure that my sister would get every milk and provision that she needed. So I'd put my sister on my back and climb the mountain and go to the Catholic Church, and I would fight for her own provision. And it got to the point where people knew that wherever I was standing, don't go close there. Because she will grab the provision for her sister. And if you thought you were strong and you were going to push me and take it, you were wasting your time. You were not going to get it. So why do I go through this? I had an emotional, I had a physical, I had a cognitive sense of the Nigerian war. I saw my sister, I would carry my sister in the fireplace just to keep her warm. Because when you have kwashiorkor, it's tough. So I have, if I give you a photograph of my tie, you would see the burn. One of the days that I carried my sister, both of us fell off asleep. And then my dress got burnt until I felt the burn. Then I woke. And all of here has the burn. So I do have the image of the Nigerian Civil War on my body every day. And I do remember the number of uncles and cousins and friends and everything that we lost, whether it was in terms of human life or in terms of possession or in terms of livelihood. I come from a family that can tell the story of the war in its multiplicity of dimensions. But the amazing thing was how the leadership of my father enabled us to grow out of the arches of the Civil War and to not allow our minds to be arrested permanently by the effect of the war.
But that, I think, is an absolutely amazing point that you've made. Not to let your mind be arrested at that point in time, despite still carrying the scars from that point in time. I mean, I, like you, am also from a refugee family. That's how we wound up in New Zealand from the wars in China. But you are marked by that moment in time, whether you like it or not. Something in the back of your head is going still very much to remember those moments of great misery and great poverty and great struggle. How much of that is still remembered in Nigeria today? I mean, the whole issue of Biafra has not been forgotten. There are still people bearing the scars physically and mentally. And this is made surely for problems of a unified Nigeria in today's world.
We missed an incredible opportunity to build from the arches, the memory, the arches of the very, very, a very scary situation. It was something that left an incredible mark on many families. I recall when the war ended and we had to return to Lagos, because my father was then again transferred back from Port Harcourt to Lagos, and we had to return to Lagos. I had missed, my education because for the 3 years of the war, we didn't go to school. So what my dad did was to start a school. literally, with all the refugee children and ourselves. And, he was trying to bridge the gap of knowledge for us. And, we went back to Lagos. We had to end up in slums. Most Igbo people that returned after the war, they returned broken. They returned without much, to count for themselves. And so you had to build back. I mean, I recall how some of our family friends couldn't get past the thought that, assets that had been acquired as out of hard work were now called abandoned properties. And my grandmom, suffered a lot of that. We suffered our own. And suddenly you went from one social and economic status to something you couldn't quite, describe. In that moment of post-war Nigeria was incredible opportunity for us to go from country to nation, but we missed it.
But how did you miss it? I mean, I've been down on those very slums in Lagos that you mentioned, and of course, they're desperate places even now. The government after the war, the federal government, announced that it would be reconciliation, but no concrete actions were actually taken to try to help people like your family, other people who had to go to the slums. What really was missed was some kind of programmatic reintegration of people back into society. And I think that lack of any kind of clearly thought out program might perhaps also have spoken to an unwillingness actually to make that effort on the part of the government to reintegrate everybody into one nation.
That could take us on a journey to defining government and to understanding this. Today we all talk about good governance and the critical pillars that define good governance. And so you talk about equity, you talk about equality, you talk about inclusion, you talk about transparency, accountability, the rule of law. What we had then as government had nothing of all of these characteristics because it was a military government. And so a military government not particularly ready to understand the emotional aftermath of a war, simply said, no victor, no vanquished, and we're going to do the 3 R's. And that was just a statement. A lot needed to go into the process of rebuilding the fractured fabric. The fractured fabric of society needed to go into creating a basis for open admission of mistakes and a willingness to try to understand what went wrong and how to ensure that there would not be a repeat of it. Now, at that point in time, as I've reflected on what I've seen across the continent of Africa, I said that what we missed was unbelievable. Because we didn't even give it any thought, right? There was not much of a reflection about it. Whenever there has been a reflection about the aftermath of a war, or in the aftermath of a war, 2 things can happen. You reflect so well that you end up as a Rwanda, or you reflect so badly and you end up as a Humpty-Dumpty DRC, or any other country that after the war just couldn't get its act together. We simply did not reflect effectively, we did not reflect profoundly, and so we ended up denying. So there is the conspiracy of silence that says the less we talk about the war, the better for all of us. And so I arrived at the Ministry of Education And I saw that history was gone. And I said, no, we must have history. History, we have to have a curriculum review. And I said, we need to have history. History is important. The American child is able to tell you about the American Civil War. They have an understanding of it. It hasn't in any way crippled them. Enabling people to remember doesn't cripple people if you allowed them to remember in a positive kind of way. Out of the ashes of war can come a lot that leads a people to greater heights of accomplishment. I still rue the fact that we remain a country. One of our foremost leaders in the country said that Nigeria is not a country. What did he call it? He said a mere geographical expression. We didn't take a walk from country to nation. Country is a mere geographic space of people recognized as a country according to the parameters of the United Nations. But a nation is really about people who over time have negotiated and been able to get to the point where they can say, we have a shared identity that comes out of shared vision and shared values. There is a gap. That gap existed from out of the Nigerian Civil War. And what our political class have done is to ignore that gap. And so all the time, when you see things happen in my country, you see that people have decided if our leaders are not going to do it, then we can figure a way to do it ourselves. And it's called equal opportunity to suffer. So when this suffering goes from people who suffered during the Civil War, and then you have the Southerners, Niger Delta, suffering as a result of the sheer environmental devastation of their land and the sense of exclusion that they felt, people say to them, shut up, are you the only ones? After all, we suffered our own. And then they are crying and saying, why is nobody listening to us? And then suddenly, you hear the cries of the people in the middle belt. It's called the North Central. So they are suffering, saying, we are minority in the North. Nobody cares about us. Everyone looks at them and says, you are troublemakers, just shut up. You know, what are you crying about? You're not alone. So just deal with it. And then they're sitting in their corner wondering, why are the rest of Nigerians so wicked? You know, and then suddenly we hear the Southwesterners crying because they said, oh, you know, we won the elections of 1993, and suddenly the mandate has been removed, and all of us have been pursued into exile, and the rest of the country, they're just looking away. Why is nobody caring? People say, oh, you people, are you not the troublesome ones? You're the ones who benefited when we suffered. So deal with your suffering. It's your own time to suffer. And then the next thing, the suffering lands in the Northeast, and the rest of Nigerians see some of the news occasionally, not through the national media, but through media abroad, and they see it and they say, oh, so this is happening in Nigeria. Where is it happening? And they say, oh, it's happening to them. Good for them. After all, they are the ones who made every other person suffer. And I'm saying, okay, so let us assume that even that kind of a thought process made any sense to you. The suffering has gone round. Is it not now time to stop it and to actually discuss? And to actually discuss, and to actually put it all out there. And then in putting it all out there, to be guided by, I love empathy. I believe that no definition of good governance can complete itself without talking about empathetic governance. Empathetic governance is the kind of governance where the leader realizes that they don't live for themselves. That is, the basic definition of leadership for me is sacrifice. And so if that forms the basis of a conversation around, how do we govern ourselves differently? How do we govern ourselves better? Then what would happen is that it would force us to be analytical. We need to be analytical. We need to really look at it and say, should I, as a citizen of Nigeria, from the southern part of the country, be excited to see the depth of acute poverty in the north? I would ask myself that. If I'm analytical, I would ask myself that question. Then, when I ask myself that question, I would conclude that, it really is not good for that to be so, because the negative externality of acute poverty in the north means that there would be an impact on the overall. And so I'm going to be interested in saying, what are the drivers of poverty in the north? And in having that conversation, I would also have to confront the fact that some of my own people are going to say, why are you bothered about the poverty in the north? Have you forgotten that they governed the country the most? So when they governed the country, why didn't they fix? They are part of the world. And then I'm able to analytically say to the person, actually, in governing the country the most, they had collaborators from the rest of the country. And in the collaborators that they had from the rest of the country, how much of a difference happened in your village? So analytical conversation is what we must have. And that is possible only to the extent that we are willing to be transparent about what we think, about what we feel, about what we believe we should have. I come from Southeast Nigeria. We're the most mobile of Nigerians. We're very, some people like to say, these people come from the inner part. No, we're the most cosmopolitan in a way, because it doesn't matter what rural enclave you think of, there is an Igbo man or woman there. So that capacity to be mobile also offers us an open-mindedness, right? Yet, in our open-mindedness, there is a place where the healing of that sense of having been rejected by the rest still lies. And it's got to heal. We have a role to heal it ourselves. The rest of Nigeria, that has also suffered different types of hurts, would need to also heal. So we've got to have a conversation that is midwifed in a way by ordinary people who know that it is better to be part of a big-sized, diverse country than to be some small country. Look at Rwanda. For all the great things that my dear friend, he's one of the leaders that I work for, of all the great things that happens in Rwanda, I sometimes wish that Rwanda were the size of Nigeria. Then it would have such strategic import on the map of the world.
Well, Nigeria is the size it is. It's one of the great countries in Africa. You're quite right that it has to go through this process of analytical healing. Can you be analytically healing and empathetic at the same time, particularly as new divisions are making themselves felt in today's Nigeria? When we talk about the Northeast, for instance, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, and that is the whole question of militant Islam, the whole question of Boko Haram, the terrible things that are happening in that part of Nigeria, and again, the total ineptitude of the government in trying to do something about that situation, and the ineptitude of the army in trying to resolve that situation. So it goes beyond empathy and returns to the whole question of forceful programmatic determination and planning.
Indeed, indeed. And so what is it that, that I see? What I see is the nation state, the idea that you need capable states is so on the line of the inability that we have heard to use state policy as a way of creating the basis for people to have a stake in society. So that failure to have created a Nigeria that offered equal opportunity to thrive, equal opportunity to be rewarded for your effort, equal opportunity to know that merit would drive reward. You know, all of those gaps, rather, that we see is because of the weakness of the nation state. So we need to rebuild the strictures and the structures of a modern Nigerian state. But then it takes people. So you find yourself in a dilemma, in a catch-22 situation. It is not, there's no incentive for the parasitic, dysfunctional, buccaneering elite class that has foisted the level of acute poverty that we should not have in a country like mine to want to change the status quo. So whether they be from the south, east, west, north, they're comfortable enough to ignore all the others that are not part of this process of the benefits of governance. That's where the idea that citizens need to be more literate about governance. For me, I believe that informed, active, engaged citizens of Nigeria will get to the point where analysis tells them that the poor man in Kano is as doomed and damned as the poor woman in Newe.
Hey, wow. I think that at this point in time, since we have a number of the citizens of Nigeria and diaspora here, they might want to make some comments of their own. Does anybody have any comments or questions they want to direct, particularly to Oby, from the audience at this moment in time? Yes, my brother here.
Stephen is talking like us now. He said, my brother here. That's kind of cute.
Thank you, sir. Madam, due process.
Oh, that follows me everywhere.
Madam, I have listened to you attentively, and I want to take you back to activities before the current regime. I know your disappointment with the Chibok girls, but I'll go a little beyond that. I also know your activities or part of them prior to the 2015 elections. With what you've just said now and your knowledge of where we were and where we are today, and with particular reference to the theme of this conference, I'd like to know deeply, please, in your support for the current regime, I knew when there was a retreat, you addressed them at the retreat before the elections. Did you in any way believe that the dividends of democracy, including the issue of the Chibok girls, would be addressed differently as you find it today? Thank you very much.
Would you like me to take a couple? And then?
There's another question on the Chibok question in particular. Yes, over here. Sorry, no, it's not about the Chibok. Okay, let's have a thematic question. Yes, in the front row there, please, in the grey.
Hello, my name is Hassan Aliyu, and I'm an artist. And my question is on which has not even been addressed and doesn't even get addressed at the government level.
So why don't I start with your question on tribalism and say that how often do you find Nigerians in regular life spending their time in the private sector discussing tribalism? How often? No. No, it's not that it's not enough. It is simply that at a level of openness and a willingness for the system to allocate its resources efficiently and effectively and on the basis of merit, people don't need to worry about tribalism. So in many ways, what we need to understand is that when these conversations on tribalism thrive, it is because there's an exploitative elite class that when it wants to gain access to something, just pulls the trigger of tribalism, and they pretend to you that the language you speak matters. Well, when they get to the altar of corruption, they don't ask themselves what language they speak. The language becomes one. And that one language is we've got to pillage the Nigerian treasury. So what I am saying is that we need to be more analytical about some of these issues. We need to get to the point where we're saying, what really are we fighting for? I want us to fight for a society that understands that if we are not productive and we're not competitive, we're just going to be at the bottom of the economic league table of the world. And we're just going to be busy counting the price of oil when there is much more to us than oil. We need to have those kinds of profound conversations and not be held hostage by a bunch of rascals who simply look at the Nigerian state as an artifact that needs to be distributed amongst a few people. So tribalism for me, I am not being starry-eyed and saying it doesn't exist. There is some of that. You have to deal with it. But when nations that are diverse are governed properly, they understand how to use the tools of diversity and inclusion to the good of everybody. Does that answer your question? Okay. The gentleman was, he's one of those who do their best to try to pin everything that I have done about Chibok girls to some support for APC. You were trying to be clever, but I could say it. I could say it. I welcome that question. And the only way to answer is to say to you, it would be good for you to have read my lecture to the APC at the summit that they had invited me. As a matter of fact, when I got an email saying they would like me to be the keynote speaker at the launch of their blueprint, I sent back an email and said, I think you sent it to the wrong person. No, we really want you to come. And I thought, me, Oby Ezekwesili, you want me to come? I said, how many of you can stand my candle? You're inviting me. And when I went there, I gave them my candle. And, when I was coming, I was very well received. When I was leaving, I had to find my way to my car. I had to find my way to my car. Because I look, like the Nigerian lingo says, I no send you. For me, the issue is the issue of governance. And so I took an approach on what they said was the plan for economy. I took it from a political economy conversation to show that many times people who are trained in the field of economic policy like me or any of you here, we always just imagine that if we can just get the fiscal reform right, get the monetary policy right, everything would be fine. And then suddenly we realize that politics political institutions and the incentives that drive them can destroy everything that we would do in terms of economic reforms. So I now spent time to understand what happened with our political institutions, political incentives, and I could just see a common thread. We just had been taken hostage by a bunch of people who, over the decades, never really thought about nation. It was really always almost about, I think there's my friend, Joseph, Professor, Mike Joseph, I think. He says it's prebendalism, prebends. The Catholic prebends? Everybody just come, you get your own share of the prebends. So that's what happened to us. So politically, we never matured. We never matured. Because we never matured politically, we have the challenges that we're dealing with. And so, when I was serving a PDP government, they called me saboteur. Because they thought I was a strange person. And for reforming the public procurement system, they said I didn't want the development of Nigeria. Who? I didn't want the development of your pocket, you mean? So you need to understand this. When I was speaking to this group of people, I was speaking as a frustrated citizen, saying, how are we going to get our political context right to be able to deliver good, sound economic policy? That was the question. Now, on the government that existed at that time, I had a running battle with that government because I could see the pillaging. You're seeing it now because you get all these news. But I am in the field of economic policy. As vice president at the World Bank, Nigeria was also my client country. I was seeing it. I was seeing the mess. And at some point, I took them on. And I said, the wealth and poverty of a nation, who will restore the dignity of Nigeria? It was a lecture I gave at my alma mater. And it zeroed in on the fact that this oil rent that has warped our choices is going to get us not up, but below sea level. And for that, I paid a costly price because, my purely professional conversation was turned into politics. I don't even, I'm taking my time to explain this to you. I don't bother. Anyone that says I am anything, good for you. As long as I know who I am.
Well, I think we all know who you are. But ladies and gentlemen, despite the fact that this could go on for quite a long time, you have a program which, at this precise moment in time, is about to turn into, I think, a different session. Is that right? So I think that what we need to do now is to make sure that there is fairness to the speakers coming after us. But I think that we should all thank Oby very, very much for her wonderful